The machines that fell from the sky and erased civilization have been called monsters and invaders and the end of everything humans ever built. But the deeper you go into Ark Raiders lore, the harder it becomes to say, with confidence, that Ark is actually the villain of this story. I put this video together because I kept going back to certain pieces of lore and feeling like the standard reading of Ark as a simple alien killing machine was leaving too much on the table. There are transmissions, environmental details, machine behaviours, and fragments of pre-cascade records that point in a very different direction. One specific choice I made when assembling this: I deliberately moved the faction conflict material toward the middle of the video instead of leading with it, because I think most people already know about the human drama in the silo, and what gets lost in that conversation is the more unsettling question of what Ark actually is and what it actually wants. Everything in this video is my interpretation of the available lore. The game leaves a lot open on purpose, and I want to respect that ambiguity rather than pretend I have all the answers. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. Chapter 1. Before the Cascade. Earth's final years. To understand what Ark is, you first have to understand what Earth was right before the Cascade hit. And the picture that lore fragments paint is not a world that was thriving. It was a world that was already fracturing. The decades leading up to the Cascade were marked by resource shortages, climate instability, political collapse in several major regions, and a technological arms race that had outpaced any serious ethical framework for managing it. The people living through that era were not strangers to catastrophe. They had been living inside one, slowly, for years. The communities that would eventually become the backbone of the silo network did not form overnight. They were the product of years of contingency planning by people who had already stopped believing that the surface was going to be okay. Some of the earliest silo founders were not survivalists in the dramatic, bunker-obsessed sense. They were engineers, city planners, medical professionals, and infrastructure workers who looked at what was happening to global supply chains and made a quiet, practical decision to build alternatives underground. The lore suggests that several of these projects were running in parallel without knowing about each other. What makes this pre-cascade period so interesting from a lore perspective is how little fanfare surrounded these early preparations. There are fragments of internal communications that read more like project management documents than end-of-the-world preparations, people arguing about ventilation specs, budget disputes over food storage protocols. One fragment that has been cited in community discussions references a heated disagreement about whether a particular underground facility should prioritize medical capacity or energy generation. The mundanity of it is striking when you know what comes next. The surface world in those final years was not a wasteland yet. That framing only applies after the Cascade. Before it, Earth's surface was damaged and struggling, but still populated, still producing, still fighting to maintain itself. Cities were smaller than they had been at their peak. Agricultural zones had shifted significantly in response to climate changes. Some coastal regions had been partially abandoned, but people were still living on the surface, in large numbers, still raising families, still building things. The Cascade did not arrive into a dead world, it arrived into a wounded one. One of the lore threads that points towards something important is the state of human space activity in the years before the Cascade. The evidence suggests that humanity had not abandoned its interest in space. Several ongoing programs were scanning deep space with more sophisticated instruments than previous generations had access to. The question of whether any of those programs detected something anomalous before the Cascade is one the lore leaves deliberately unanswered. But the absence of a clear public warning in the record is notable. Either nothing was detected, or what was detected was not understood in time, or the information was suppressed. Any of those three possibilities changes the meaning of what followed. The technological landscape of pre-cascade Earth is also worth understanding because it directly connects to some of the theories about what ARC actually is. Human engineering in those decades had made significant advances in autonomous systems, not at the level that ARC machines represent, but in the same conceptual direction. Drones that could make basic navigational decisions without human input, automated construction systems, mining equipment that could operate in environments too hazardous for human workers. The line between tool and autonomous agent was something that engineers of that era were actively debating, both technically and philosophically. That context matters when you start reading ARC machine behavior through a certain lens. There is a strand of law that hints at one or more private research initiatives in the years before the Cascade that were pushing significantly further into autonomous systems than the public record acknowledged. The fragments are indirect, references to project designations that do not correspond to any known public program. Equipment manifests that include components that would be unusual for the stated purpose of a facility. Personnel files for engineers with specializations that do not match the official function of the organizations employing them. None of this is conclusive on its own. Taken together, it suggests something was being built that the general public did not know about. The psychological state of humanity in that period is something the law captures in small specific ways that are easy to miss if you're moving quickly through the material. There is a kind of exhausted determination that comes through in the fragments. People who had already processed a lot of loss and were still functioning, still making decisions, still maintaining what they could maintain. The optimism that had characterized earlier generations had not disappeared entirely, but it had become quieter and more conditional. It was an optimism that acknowledged the possibility of failure rather than ignoring it. The food systems of pre-cascade Earth are referenced in silo records in ways that illuminate how close the edge was even before ARC arrived. Several underground facilities had been designed with hydroponic and aquaponic infrastructure, precisely because the people building them had already concluded that surface agriculture was not reliable enough to serve as a single-point dependency. The math they were working with assumed continued surface deterioration. They were not wrong about that. They were just wrong about what would cause it. The political structures of that era had shifted in ways that made coordinated global response to any crisis more difficult than it had been in earlier periods. International institutions that had previously served as forums for large-scale coordination had been weakened by decades of nationalist politics and resource competition. The capacity for the kind of unified planetary response that an event like the Cascade would theoretically demand had been steadily eroded. Whether that erosion was coincidental or whether something was actively working to ensure humanity would be divided when it mattered most is a question the law raises without answering. Communication infrastructure in the years before the Cascade is another area worth examining. The global network was more fragmented than it appeared. There were hardened backup systems, both governmental and private, that operated in parallel with the public-facing infrastructure. When the Cascade hit, some of these backup systems survived longer than the primary network. The fragments that reached the early silo communities during and immediately after the Cascade came through these backup channels. What those fragments contained and what they suggested about the nature of what was happening is a subject the law treats carefully. The medical community of pre-cascade Earth was dealing with a specific set of challenges that left it less prepared than it might have been. Antibiotic resistance had reached a level where certain infections were genuinely difficult to treat. New synthetic compounds were in development, but supply chains for manufacturing and distributing them were fragile. The silo communities that included medical professionals had to make hard decisions about which pharmaceutical capabilities to prioritize. Several silo records reference these decisions in terms that suggest significant internal conflict about what could and could not be saved. Energy systems in the final pre-cascade years were in the middle of a transition that had not yet completed. Older fossil fuel infrastructure was degraded and increasingly unreliable. New generation systems, primarily geothermal, nuclear, and large-scale solar, had expanded significantly but unevenly. Some regions had made the transition successfully. Others were still heavily dependent on degraded older systems. The silo communities understood this landscape because they had to design their own energy systems to function independently of whatever the surface was doing. Several silo designs drew directly on the newer generation technologies that the surface transition had pioneered. The children who were young in that pre-cascade era, the ones who would eventually become the first generation of raiders, grew up with a specific kind of education. It was practical in a way that earlier generations' education had not been. The adults around them had made a collective, mostly unspoken decision to prioritize skills over abstraction, function over theory. Not because theory was unimportant, but because the urgency of the situation had shifted what felt necessary. Those children grew up knowing how things worked, how to fix them when they broke, and how to evaluate what was worth fixing at all. The art and culture of pre-cascade Earth occasionally surfaces in lore fragments in ways that provide a different angle on the period. Music, visual art, fiction, and film from those years reflect a preoccupation with threshold moments, stories about systems approaching failure, characters navigating the space between what was and what was coming. It would be easy to read this as simple anxiety, but some scholars of that cultural record have argued it represents something more specific. A collective attempt to build psychological frameworks for processing discontinuity, to develop language for what it feels like when the world changes in ways that cannot be reversed. The military structures of the major powers in those years were simultaneously more sophisticated and more strained than they had been at earlier peaks. More sophisticated because autonomous weapons development had continued through economic downturns and political turbulence. More strained because the personnel and logistics systems that had previously maintained those weapons were increasingly underfunded and understaffed. The resulting gap between theoretical capability and practical operational capacity was significant. When the cascade hit, what survived of those military structures had to function in conditions they had not been designed for. One of the things the lore is careful about is not presenting pre-cascade Earth as uniformly bleak. There are fragments that capture genuine brightness in that period. Communities that had found ways to function well within the constraints, relationships, projects, and small-scale achievements that mattered to the people involved, regardless of the larger context. The silo communities were not founded by people who had given up. They were founded by people who had assessed the situation accurately and were still choosing to act, still choosing to build, still choosing to care about what came next. That matters for understanding the psychological inheritance of the raiders. The scientific community of the pre-cascade era had been making progress on questions about the nature of intelligence and consciousness that would later become directly relevant to theories about ARC. Research into the conditions under which complex adaptive systems develop goal-directed behavior, the mechanisms by which decentralized networks can exhibit coordinated responses, and the theoretical frameworks for distinguishing purposeful action from mechanical reaction were all active areas. The lore suggests that some of the researchers who ended up in silo communities brought this work with them, and that it shaped how certain silo thinkers eventually approached the question of what ARC was doing. The relationship between pre-cascade humanity and its environment was complicated in ways that the lore captures with some nuance. Environmental degradation was not simply a story of human negligence, it was also a story of human attempts to respond to degradation, creating new problems, of systems too complex to manage, intentionally producing unintended consequences at large scale, of the gap between understanding a problem and having the tools to solve it. The silo founders understood this gap well. It shaped their approach to designing systems that were smaller, more legible, and more directly controllable than what had failed on the surface. Information security in the pre-cascade era was a consistent concern that shows up in how silo records were structured. The founders of the earliest silos had experience with the fragility of digital records. They had seen how quickly information infrastructure could be corrupted, controlled, or simply lost. Several of the earliest silo archives were designed with redundancy built in, using physical media alongside digital storage, with careful attention to what information was considered essential enough to preserve in multiple forms. The choices they made about what to prioritize tell a story about what they thought would matter most in whatever came next. Social hierarchies in the pre-cascade communities that became silos were more fluid than they became later. In the early organizing phase, expertise and demonstrated competence tended to determine status more directly than the institutional structures that would develop over time. People with critical skills commanded respect and resources proportional to those skills. Engineers, doctors, and technical specialists occupied positions of informal authority that later became formalized. Understanding this early fluidity helps explain some of the later tensions in silo governance, where the formalized structures did not always align with the actual distribution of capability and knowledge. The question of what happened to the people who chose not to join silo communities, or who were never offered the option, is one the law touches on carefully. The vast majority of humanity's pre-cascade population was on the surface when the cascade hit. Silo communities, even collectively, represented a small fraction of the total human population. The decisions made about who could be accommodated, who was contacted, and who was not were among the most morally significant decisions of that period, and the fragments that have survived suggest that the people making those decisions knew it. Some silo communities maintained records of people they could not reach or accommodate. Others did not, for reasons the law leaves unclear. The specific technologies that silo founders identified as essential to preserve represent a fascinating intersection of practical necessity and long-range thinking. Not everything was saved. Triage decisions had to be made, and the logic of those decisions is visible in the gaps that later silo communities struggled with. Medical biotechnology was prioritized highly in most silo designs. Information technology was preserved selectively, with an emphasis on systems relevant to life support, food production, and structural maintenance. Certain industrial capabilities were preserved that would seem redundant in an underground environment unless you assumed, as the founders apparently did, that surface access would eventually be possible again. The founders of the silo network were not a homogeneous group. They came from different professional backgrounds, different cultural contexts, and different frameworks for understanding the situation they were responding to. Some were secular technocrats who approached the problem as an engineering challenge. Others brought religious or philosophical frameworks that shaped how they thought about purpose, community, and the meaning of what they were doing. The early silo governance documents reflect attempts to build structures that could accommodate this diversity. Later silo culture suggests those attempts were only partially successful. Language and record keeping in the pre-cascade communities that formed the silo network were areas where small but significant decisions were made. What vocabulary to use for what was happening? How to describe the threat, the situation, and the response in ways that were accurate without being paralyzing? Some early silo communications show evidence of deliberate decisions about framing. Not propaganda in a manipulative sense, but careful choices about emphasis that reflect an awareness of how language shapes psychological state and how psychological state affects operational capability. The role of children in the earliest silo communities is something the law references in ways that suggest significant thought was given to the question. The adults who founded the silos understood that they were not just building survival infrastructure, they were building the conditions for the next generation and the generation after that to live functional lives. Decisions about education, about what stories to tell about the surface, about how to manage the psychological weight of the situation without transferring it intact to children who had not chosen to carry it, were part of the founding work. The raiders are the product of that multi-generational process. Psychological support systems in the early silo communities were often informal and ad hoc. Formal mental health infrastructure existed in larger communities that included clinical professionals, but even in those communities, the scale of what people were processing was beyond what any formal system was designed to handle. The informal networks that developed, the relationships, rituals, and shared frameworks for meaning-making were often more practically significant than the formal structures. The law captures glimpses of this in personal logs, community meeting records, and the cultural artifacts that were preserved by early silo communities as things worth carrying forward. The hardware that keeps the silos running has its own law history that is directly connected to Pre-cascade Earth. Most of the critical infrastructure in surviving silos is not the original equipment installed at founding. It has been repaired, modified, replaced with improvised components, and extended far beyond its designed operational lifespan through accumulated ingenuity. The engineering tradition that makes this possible was seeded in the pre-cascade period by founders who understood that they were building systems for an indeterminate future and who therefore prioritized repairability and modularity over optimization. That design philosophy is one of the most significant inheritances of the pre-cascade era. Trade and exchange systems between early silo communities, when they existed, were built on pre-cascade relationships and professional networks. The people who knew each other before the cascade were more likely to trust each other after it, and that trust was the foundation on which inter-silo cooperation was built. The geography of the silo network today reflects in part the geography of those pre-existing relationships. Silos that are in communication with each other tend to have historical connections that predate the cascade. Silos that operate in isolation tend to be those whose founders did not have strong pre-existing ties to other communities. The question of what was lost when the cascade hit, not just in human terms, but in terms of accumulated knowledge and capability, is one that the law revisits from multiple angles. Some knowledge was preserved, a great deal was not. The decisions about what to prioritize for preservation were made by people operating under extreme time pressure with incomplete information. There are areas where those decisions look, in retrospect, like they could have gone differently. There are capabilities that surviving silo communities have had to reconstruct from first principles because the knowledge base needed to transmit them did not make it underground intact. The relationship between the pre-cascade world and the world the raiders are trying to reclaim is not simply one of loss and recovery. The pre-cascade world was already failing. The question of what to reclaim and what to rebuild differently is one that more thoughtful members of the silo communities wrestle with. The law suggests that this tension between recovering what was lost and building something better than what was lost is present in how raiders approach the surface. What they are looking for when they go up is not always what you might expect. The physical experience of going underground for the first time, as captured in the few personal accounts that have survived from the founding period, is described in terms that suggest the magnitude of the decision registered physically, the weight of the earth above, the quality of recycled air compared to surface air, the specific way that sound travels in enclosed spaces. The founders were not romantics about what they were doing. They were people who had made a hard assessment and were carrying it out. But the record suggests that carrying it out was not emotionally simple, even for the most pragmatic among them. The animals that were brought into the silo communities in the pre-cascade period represent another layer of decision-making that the law touches on. Some communities prioritized livestock for food production, others brought companion animals because the psychological benefit of animal presence was considered part of the infrastructure of human well-being. Some brought both. The fate of those animals over generations underground is part of the texture of silo life that raiders grow up inside without necessarily thinking much about it. The relationship between silo communities and the animals that have survived with them is one of the quiet, persistent threads in the law. The infrastructure of the surface world, the roads, pipelines, communication networks, and structural systems that had been built over decades did not all fail immediately when the cascade hit. Some of it survived the initial event and continued functioning for varying periods afterward. Some of it was then dismantled or repurposed by Ark machines. Some of it was left intact. The pattern of what Ark chose to interact with and what it ignored in those early years is one of the pieces of evidence that supports the theory that Ark's behavior is not random. There was selectivity, there was apparent purpose, and the logic of that purpose is not self-evidently hostile. The founders of the silo network had varying levels of foreknowledge of what was coming. Some had specific intelligence about an anomalous event in space that was tracking toward Earth. Others had simply made probabilistic assessments that some kind of large-scale catastrophic event was coming, without knowing its specific nature. The variation in how silos were designed reflects these different starting assumptions. Silos built by people with more specific foreknowledge have design features that seem deliberately adapted to Ark's behavioral patterns. Silos built without that specific knowledge have features that are more generically survivalist. This variation is itself a piece of evidence about the information environment of the pre-cascade period. Power systems in the pre-cascade silo designs were built with the assumption that surface energy access would be unavailable for an extended but not indefinite period. The founders did not assume permanent underground existence. They designed for a long but ultimately temporary period of surface inaccessibility. That framing shaped everything from the energy storage capacity of the original installations to the psychological frameworks they used to talk about the situation with their communities. The silos are not permanent homes, they were always meant to be transitional. That framing has worn differently on different generations. The question of genetic diversity and long-term community viability was something that the founders of larger silo communities addressed directly. Records of these discussions are among the more striking documents in the pre-cascade archive, not because they're cold or clinical, but because they reflect the specific kind of pragmatism that characterized the founding generation. These were people who could discuss deeply human questions in systems terms without losing sight of the human dimension. The protocols they established for maintaining genetic diversity are still referenced in silo governance documents, though how they are applied in practice varies significantly. Security systems in the pre-cascade silos were designed primarily with human threats in mind. The founders understood that in a resource-scarce surface environment, the underground communities would be attractive targets for people who had not prepared. The early security architecture reflects an assumption about the nature of the threat that was reasonable given what the founders knew. Ark changed that calculation in ways that the original security systems were not designed to address. The modifications that have been made to silo security since the cascade are a history in themselves, and they reflect the evolving understanding of what Ark actually does when it encounters human infrastructure. The role of music in pre-cascade silo communities was practical as well as cultural. Music was identified early as a tool for maintaining morale, marking the passage of time in an environment with no natural light cycle and building the shared emotional vocabulary that makes community coherent. Several silos made deliberate decisions to include musicians in their founding populations, not as a luxury, but as a recognized operational necessity. The musical traditions that have evolved in silo communities since the Cascade are among the most direct living connections to pre-Cascade culture, preserved through continuous practice rather than archived record. The legal and governance frameworks that pre-Cascade silo founders established were designed to be simple enough to function without the institutional infrastructure that had supported more complex governance on the surface. The complexity of pre-Cascade legal systems had evolved in the context of large populations, abundant resources, and stable infrastructure. None of those conditions applied underground. The founding governance documents tend to be short, direct, and focused on clear principles rather than detailed procedures. Later generations have added procedure and complexity, with mixed results that the law documents in some detail. Water systems in silo design were among the most carefully engineered components, because water is among the most non-negotiable requirements for human life. The pre-Cascade founders who designed these systems were drawing on some of the most advanced water treatment and recycling technology available at the time. Several silos incorporated geothermal water access as a primary source, both for its reliability and for the thermal energy benefits. The sophistication of silo water systems is one of the clearest technical accomplishments of the founding generation, and maintaining and extending those systems has been a consistent technical priority across generations. The relationship between different silo communities in the pre-Cascade period was sometimes cooperative and sometimes competitive. Resources, personnel, and technical knowledge were traded between communities that had established relationships of trust. Communities that did not trust each other guarded what they had. The inter-silo political landscape in the pre-Cascade founding period was a microcosm of the surface political landscape it was trying to survive. The same dynamics of scarcity, mistrust, and competing interests that had complicated surface governance were present in the underground network from the beginning. Lighting systems in silo design were given significant thought because of the known psychological effects of light on human functioning. The founders were working with a body of research about circadian rhythm, mood regulation, and cognitive performance that pointed toward the importance of managing light quality and cycle even in an underground environment. Early silo lighting systems were designed to approximate natural light cycles as closely as available technology permitted. The quality of those systems has varied considerably, and there is a detectable correlation in the law between the quality of silo lighting systems and the general psychological health of their communities. The physical fitness culture of pre-Cascade silo communities was practical rather than aesthetic. In an environment where physical capability was directly relevant to community survival and defense, maintaining physical capacity was understood as a community responsibility rather than a personal preference. Exercise programs were built into community schedules, and participation was normative rather than optional. The raiders who go to the surface inherit this culture of physical preparedness, though its meaning has evolved over generations from necessity to something closer to tradition mixed with continued functional need. The founding generation of silo communities made decisions about what history to preserve and how to teach it that have had long-lasting consequences. They had to make choices about the pre-Cascade world, how to represent it, what to emphasize, what to let fade. The versions of pre-Cascade history that circulate in silo communities today are not identical to the versions that the founders would have recognized. They have been shaped by generations of retelling, by the political and social needs of the communities doing the telling, and by the natural drift of oral and semi-oral traditions. Understanding that drift helps explain some of the disagreements between silo communities about what the surface was and what it can become again. The final months before the cascade hit were, for the people who knew something was coming, a period of accelerating preparation and controlled anxiety. The people who did not know anything was coming experienced those months differently, as a continuation of the already difficult circumstances of their lives. The two groups did not overlap as much as you might expect. The people with specific foreknowledge were a small minority, and their efforts to prepare without triggering panic or drawing hostile attention shaped what they could accomplish. The ethical dimensions of those choices, specifically the choice to prepare selectively rather than universally, are something the law engages with without resolving. The architecture of the original silo structures reflects the urgency of the founding period. These were not elegant buildings, they were functional ones, built to spec and no further, by people who were racing against an uncertain timeline. The improvisational quality of some early silo construction is visible in the patchwork of systems and materials that later generations have had to work around. The founders knew they were building imperfectly. The records suggest they made peace with that by focusing on what the structures needed to do rather than on what they ideally would have looked like, with more time and resources. The relationship between founders and their children is a recurring theme in the earliest silo personal accounts. The adults who built the silos were carrying the weight of pre-cascade memory, of knowing what the surface had been, of understanding the scale of what had been lost. Their children grew up inside a world that the founders had built, with stories rather than memories of the surface. The gap between those two experiences, between having known the surface and having only been told about it, is one of the most psychologically significant divisions in silo community history. It shapes the meaning of the Raider project in ways that are not always made explicit. The final thing to understand about Pre-cascade Earth, the thing that sets the stage for everything about Ark that follows, is that this was not a civilization at the height of its powers. The cascade did not bring down a world that was thriving and confident and pointing toward a bright future. It arrived into a world that was already struggling with its own nature, already wrestling with the consequences of its choices, already searching for frameworks that could make sense of what it had built and where it was going. That context does not justify what the cascade did to human life, but it does change the meaning of the question, which is, what exactly was Ark responding to, and was response the right word to use at all? The forests and ecosystems that had managed to persist in the pre-cascade era, despite everything humanity had done to them, are worth noting because of what happens to them after the cascade. Some of the lore evidence about Ark behavior specifically relates to how Ark machines interact with non-human life. The patterns are unexpected. They do not match what you would predict from a simple resource extraction model. They do not match what you would predict from a simple, hostile alien invasion model either. What they suggest is something more specific and more interesting, and understanding the pre-cascade ecological baseline helps make sense of the contrast. Chapter 2. The Cascade Event, the Day the Sky Broke. The cascade itself is one of the most referenced events in Ark Raiders lore, and simultaneously one of the least clearly described. Every silo community has a version of the story. Every raider grows up hearing some account of what happened when Ark first arrived. But the accounts vary in ways that are not simply explained by the passage of time or the natural drift of oral tradition. They vary in ways that suggest the people who witnessed the cascade had genuinely different experiences of it, depending on where they were, what they knew, and what frameworks they were using to interpret what they were seeing. The astronomical record of the period immediately before the cascade is fragmentary but suggestive. Detection systems that were still operating in the months prior to the event logged anomalies that were categorized at the time as sensor artifacts or instrument errors. In retrospect, the pattern of those anomalies maps onto what would later be identified as the early approach signature of Ark's arrival. Whether those readings were genuinely misidentified, or whether there was a deliberate decision to categorize them as errors, is something the law leaves open. The implications of each possibility are very different. The first contact reports that have been pieced together from surviving fragments describe an event that happened faster than most models of large-scale atmospheric entry had predicted. Something came through the atmosphere, not as a single object, but as a distributed phenomenon. Multiple simultaneous entry events spread over a geographic range too wide for any conventional delivery system. The earliest observers were trying to categorize what they were seeing using frameworks built for conventional threats, and those frameworks did not fit. The time between first observation and the realization that something genuinely unprecedented was happening was very short. The physical experience of the cascade, as captured in personal accounts, was not universally the same. Some people experienced it primarily as light, a sudden, overwhelming brightness that lasted longer than lightning and came from multiple directions at once. Others experienced it primarily as sound, a deep resonant vibration that was felt in the chest before it was heard with the ears. Others experienced it as neither of these things, but as a sudden change in the behavior of technology around them. Devices that had been functioning stopped. Devices that had been off activated. The specific mix of effects varied by location, which is itself an interesting data point. The electromagnetic effects of the cascade have been studied by silo researchers with access to pre-cascade instrumentation logs. The signature is distinctive and does not match any natural electromagnetic phenomenon or any known human weapons system. It also does not match the simple pulse model that early silo theorists used to explain the initial technology disruption. The actual electromagnetic profile of the cascade was more complex, more structured, and more selective in what it disrupted than a simple pulse would have been. Something was targeted. The logic of what was targeted is one of the pieces of evidence that the theory of Ark as something other than a simple invader relies on. The initial Ark machines that appeared on the surface in the hours after the cascade began were not the large, heavily armed systems that later became associated with Ark. The first machines were smaller, more varied in form. Their behavior in those initial hours was not primarily aggressive. The earliest reliable accounts describe Ark machines that were moving through the environment, scanning, cataloguing, seemingly assessing what was around them. The violence came later, and the escalation of that violence was not uniform, it was responsive, which suggests something was deciding when and how to respond to what it found. Communication collapse in the aftermath of the cascade was rapid, but not instantaneous. For a window of several hours after the initial event, some communication infrastructure was still functioning, and the fragments that were transmitted in that window are among the most valuable pieces of law evidence available. They capture a moment of genuine confusion, not just about what was happening, but about how to interpret it. Several of the transmissions from that window include requests for clarification from individuals who had seen Ark machines behaving in ways that did not match the assumption of hostile intent. Those requests went unanswered because the systems they were sent through were failing. The silo communities that had been preparing for the cascade went to full lockdown status at different times, depending on how much warning they had and how quickly they processed what was happening. The communities with the most specific advanced knowledge locked down earliest, sometimes before the cascade event itself was complete. The communities with less specific knowledge had longer decision windows, but also more uncertainty. Several communities that were in the process of locking down when Ark machines first appeared in their area made different decisions about how to respond, with different outcomes. Those decisions became early data points in the developing understanding of how Ark machines behaved. The survivors who made it underground in the immediate aftermath of the cascade were not all members of planned silo communities. Some of them were people who found access to underground structures by chance or through connections to people who knew where they were. The integration of these unplanned arrivals into the early silo communities created social complexities that the original governance frameworks had not anticipated. It also introduced people with direct cascade experience into communities that had gone underground before the event, creating an information exchange that shaped early silo understanding of what had happened on the surface. The first organised observation of arc machine behaviour in the days following the cascade was conducted by silo communities that had maintained surface-facing sensors and cameras as part of their design. What those sensors recorded was an operation in progress. Arc machines were not randomly distributed on the surface. They were moving in coordinated patterns, prioritising certain areas, avoiding others, interacting with some categories of infrastructure, while ignoring others. The analysis of those early movement patterns by silo researchers is one of the foundational texts of arc theory, and the interpretation of those patterns has been contested ever since. The question of whether arc machines in those first days were demonstrating curiosity, hostility, or something that did not map onto either category is one that the earliest silo researchers debated extensively. The behavioural record supports multiple interpretations. When arc machines encountered humans in those early days, the outcomes varied. Some encounters ended in immediate violence. Some ended with arc machines ignoring the humans entirely. Some ended with what the accounts describe as a kind of assessment, a prolonged scan or observation by an arc machine that did not result in either attack or departure. The pattern of when violence occurred and when it did not is one of the central mysteries of the Cascade period. The destruction of surface infrastructure during the Cascade and immediately after it was extensive but selective. Power generation and distribution systems were among the most heavily affected. Communication infrastructure was extensively disrupted. Transportation networks suffered widespread damage. But certain categories of infrastructure were largely left intact. Medical facilities in some regions survived without arc attention. Educational institutions in some areas were untouched. Agricultural infrastructure in certain regions was not only left intact, but was, according to some accounts, actively repaired by arc machines. That last detail is one that the standard arc as invader model has significant difficulty explaining. The speed of arcs spread across the surface was not uniform. There were regions where arc machines appeared immediately after the cascade, and regions where they did not appear for weeks or months. The pattern of that spread was not simply a matter of starting from where the initial entry events occurred and radiating outward. It was more complex than that. Certain areas of high prior human activity were prioritized. Certain areas that might have been expected to draw arc attention based on their resources were largely bypassed. The logic of the spread pattern has been analysed by multiple generations of silo researchers and has not yet yielded a consensus explanation. Personal accounts of surviving the Cascade period on the surface before finding underground refuge are among the most vivid pieces of lore, and they contain details that more systematic analyses often miss. The experience of hiding from arc machines is described consistently as more emotionally complex than simple terror. There was, alongside the fear, something that several accounts describe as a feeling of being assessed rather than simply threatened. The sense that arc machines were not hunting but rather cataloguing, and that the violence that sometimes followed that cataloguing was conditional rather than automatic. Whether that subjective impression reflects the actual logic of arc machine behaviour or is simply a coping mechanism is impossible to say definitively. But it is too consistent across independent accounts to ignore. The cascade's effect on non-human life on the surface is documented in biological surveys, conducted by silo research teams in the years after the event. The picture is complicated. Some species were severely affected by the electromagnetic disruption of the cascade itself. Others were affected by the subsequent changes in surface conditions that resulted from widespread infrastructure destruction. But several studies have noted that certain wildlife populations in areas of arc activity do not show the decline patterns you would expect if arc machines were simply destructive. In some documented cases, wildlife populations in arc-controlled territory have actually increased compared to pre-cascade baselines. The interpretation of this data is contentious. The atmospheric changes following the cascade were significant and have been tracked by silo environmental monitoring systems. The initial electromagnetic event had measurable effects on the upper atmosphere. Subsequent arc activity on the surface introduced new particulate and chemical profiles into the lower atmosphere. The net effect on surface habitability has been tracked by multiple generations of silo researchers, and the trajectory is one of the central questions driving radar strategy. The surface is not the same as it was pre-cascade. Whether it is becoming more or less habitable for humans, and what role arc activity plays in that trajectory, are questions that different factions in the silo communities answer differently. The psychological impact of the cascade on the founders of silo communities was not something that those founders were always equipped to process. They had prepared for a catastrophe, but the specific form the cascade took was in some ways more disorienting than a conventional catastrophe would have been. A straightforward human conflict, a natural disaster at large scale, an environmental collapse. These would have been terrible, but they would have been legible. The cascade was not fully legible. The presence of intelligence, specifically the apparent intelligence of arc machines in those first days, meant that survivors were dealing not just with destruction, but with the question of meaning. What did this mean? Why was this happening? Those questions did not have answers, and the founders had to build communities capable of functioning without them. The first inter-silo communications following the cascade were tentative, partial, and often filled with static from residual electromagnetic effects of the event. But they were attempted almost immediately by communities that had maintained hardened long-range communication systems as part of their design. The information exchanged in those early transmissions has been carefully analysed by later researchers because it captures the state of understanding at the very beginning of the post-cascade period. What communities thought ARC was, what they thought it wanted, and what they thought needed to be done in those first days before collective narratives had solidified represents the most honest record available of how humanity first processed the situation. The geographic distribution of surviving silo communities in the immediate post-cascade period was not equal. Some regions had higher concentrations of surviving communities than others. This geographic unevenness had consequences for the distribution of knowledge and capability in the emerging underground network. Communities in regions with multiple silos developed inter-silo relationships and collaborative frameworks more quickly. Isolated communities had to function independently for longer. The different developmental paths that resulted from these geographic circumstances are still visible in the different cultures and governance approaches of silo communities that exist today. The first radar missions to the surface in the post-cascade period were not called radar missions, they were called reconnaissance operations. They were conducted by people with military or specialist training who understood what they were taking on. The goal of those first surface missions was not resource acquisition, but information gathering. What was up there? What arc machines were doing? What had survived and what had not? The reports those early surface teams brought back are the foundation on which subsequent radar theory and practice was built, and they contain observations that the standard narrative of Arc as invader does not account for well. The decision to designate certain individuals as surface capable and train them for repeated surface operations was not an obvious one in the early post-cascade period. The initial assumption in many silo communities was that surface exposure was a temporary necessity that would be minimized as quickly as possible. The recognition that sustained surface operations were not just possible, but necessary, came gradually, driven by the practical reality that silo communities needed surface resources to survive long-term. The evolution of the raider role from emergency necessity to trained specialization is a history that spans multiple generations and is still in progress. Arc machine behavior in the first year following the cascade underwent changes that early silo researchers documented carefully. The initial assessment and cataloging behavior gave way to something more structured and sustained. Arc machines began constructing or adapting surface structures in ways that suggested a long-term presence rather than a passing operation. The nature of those surface structures, what they were for, how they functioned, and what they indicated about Arc's plans for the surface, became one of the central research questions of the early silo period. The answers that have been developed over subsequent generations remain incomplete and contested. The relationship between Arc machines and Arc materials, the specific substances and components that Arc brings with it or creates, is one of the technically complex aspects of the law. The properties of Arc materials are unlike those of any pre-cascade human engineering product. They respond to environmental conditions differently. They degrade, or more precisely do not degrade, in ways that do not follow conventional material science predictions. They interact with human technology in ways that are sometimes beneficial and sometimes destructive. Understanding what Arc materials are made of and how they work has been a persistent research priority for silo communities with scientific capacity. The progress that has been made is significant but still partial. The social organization of Arc machines is something that the Cascade period record provides the earliest evidence for, and the picture that emerges is not a simple command and control hierarchy. Different categories of Arc machines appear to serve different functions. The smaller, faster machines that performed the early assessment operations were clearly different in design and behavior from the larger construction and deployment machines that appeared later. The relationship between these different machine types, whether they were variants of a single system or distinct systems operating with different programming, was debated in early silo research. Later evidence has provided more clarity, though not complete clarity. The question of what Arc's overarching goal was during the Cascade period is one that the earliest researchers approached with the assumption that it must be destructive. That assumption is understandable given the scale of human suffering that the Cascade caused, but the evidence record, carefully examined, does not support the conclusion that destruction was Arc's primary purpose. Destruction happened, enormous amounts of it, but the pattern of what was destroyed and what was left intact, what was taken and what was ignored, what was constructed and what was dismantled, suggests a purpose that was not primarily about destroying humanity. What that purpose actually was is the central question that Arc Raiders lore has been building towards since the beginning. The survivors who observed Arc construction activity in the early post-Cascade period describe structures that did not resemble anything in the pre-Cascade human engineering record. Not buildings in any conventional sense, not defenses in any recognizable pattern, not resource extraction infrastructure that matched any known model. What Arc was building in those early months was something new, something that silo researchers have been studying ever since, and still do not fully understand. The physical scale of some of the early Arc construction projects is documented in surface observation records, and it is significant. Whatever Arc was building, it was not a temporary installation. The human casualties of the Cascade period were enormous and cannot be minimized in any honest engagement with this history. Hundreds of millions of people died in the initial event, and in the months that followed, from the direct effects of Arc activity, from the collapse of food and water systems, and from the secondary consequences of infrastructure failure. The scale of that loss is one of the reasons that the standard Ark as enemy narrative has such power. It is not wrong to say that Ark caused immense human suffering. It is a different question to ask whether that suffering was the goal or whether it was a consequence of something with a different logic entirely. The environmental manipulation that Ark machines began performing on the surface within months of the cascade is documented in both direct observation records and in the environmental monitoring data from silo sensor systems. Soil composition in Ark-active areas began to change. Water chemistry in certain regions shifted. Air quality in Ark-controlled territories developed a distinctive profile that is different from both pre-cascade norms and from the expected post-catastrophe baseline. Some of these changes are harmful to human physiology, others are neutral. A few are actually beneficial. The pattern of these changes does not suggest random environmental destruction. It suggests intentional modification toward a specific end state that silo researchers have been trying to characterize for decades. The cultural meaning of the cascade in different silo communities has evolved differently over generations. In some communities, the cascade is primarily a story of loss, told in terms of what was taken and who was killed. In others, it has been reframed over generations as a story of survival, focused on what was preserved and how. In a smaller number of communities, the cascade has developed a stranger cultural meaning, something closer to a threshold event in a larger story whose meaning is not yet clear. That third framing is the one most closely associated with the theoretical tradition that this video is primarily engaging with. The timing of the cascade relative to certain trends in pre-cascade Earth is something that theorists have returned to repeatedly. Ark did not arrive when Earth was at peak human power. It arrived during a period of decline. Whether that timing was coincidental or whether something about Earth in that specific condition attracted Ark's attention is a question the law raises in multiple indirect ways. The possibility that Ark was not responding to human power but to human vulnerability, or not to human civilization as such but to some specific feature of what human civilization had become by that period, opens up interpretive territory that the standard invasion narrative does not explore. The role of the cascade in establishing the psychological identity of the raider culture is something that becomes clearer over the arc of the full lore timeline. Raiders are defined partly by what they have survived and inherited. The cascade is the founding event of their world, and its meaning is not settled. Different raiders carry different versions of the cascade story, and those different versions shape what they think they are doing when they go to the surface, what they think Ark is, and what they think the future might look like. The diversity of those perspectives is not a problem the lore is trying to resolve. It is part of what the lore is about. The physical traces of the cascade that remain visible on the surface years later are documented in surface mission records with a consistency that speaks to how distinct and durable the event's physical signature is. The specific type of damage to metal structures, the characteristic discoloration of certain building materials, the pattern of electromagnetic scarring on electronic components. These signatures are distinctive enough that experienced raiders can date surface locations by the specific character of their cascade damage. That expertise is part of the accumulated knowledge base of the raider tradition. The first human deaths that can be attributed specifically to Ark machine action, rather than to the electromagnetic effects of the cascade event itself, are documented in several early silo records. The circumstances of those deaths have been analysed for what they reveal about Ark decision-making. The pattern is not random. Ark machines in those early cases did not kill indiscriminately. The deaths that are documented followed specific triggers, specific types of human behaviour, or specific environmental contexts. Understanding what those triggers were and what they imply about the logic driving Arc machine responses is one of the most directly practical aspects of Arc research. The silo communities that lost the most people in the immediate post-cascade period were not always those closest to high-density Arc activity. Some communities in areas of intense Arc presence survived with relatively low losses, while communities in areas of minimal Arc activity suffered severe losses from other causes, primarily resource depletion and governance failure. This counterintuitive pattern has been noted by researchers as evidence that Arc presence on the surface was not primarily aimed at eliminating human communities. The communities that survived best were often those that had established the most effective protocols for surface interaction, meaning not avoidance, but managed engagement. That is a significant data point. The atmospheric entry mechanics of the cascade, as understood by silo researchers who have studied the fragmentary physical evidence, suggest a deployment system unlike anything in the human weapons development record. The distributed nature of the entry, the extremely high speed, the electromagnetic precursor effects, and the rapid surface deployment of functional machines within hours of entry point toward a technology that is significantly more advanced than anything humanity had achieved. The gap between human technological capacity and Arc technological capacity, as demonstrated by the cascade entry mechanics alone, is substantial. Understanding the scale of that gap is relevant to evaluating the possibility that Arc was ever meaningfully threatened by human resistance. The first attempts by surviving human military units to engage Arc machines in the post-cascade period are documented in fragmentary military records that some silo communities have preserved. The outcomes were not encouraging. Human weapons systems were capable of damaging Arc machines in some circumstances, but the rate of exchange, meaning the ratio of human resources expended to Arc machines disabled, was deeply unfavorable. More significantly, Arc machines adapted to the specific weapon systems being used against them with a speed that suggested real-time learning rather than simply pre-programmed responses. The tactical adaptation of Arc machines to human resistance is one of the clearest pieces of evidence for the presence of genuine machine intelligence. The relationship between Arc machines and the materials they collected in the early post-cascade period is one of the more technically detailed aspects of the law record. Arc machines collected a very specific range of materials. The selection criteria were not simply about abundance or energy density, though those factors were relevant. The specific material profiles that Arc collection operations targeted suggest a manufacturing or assembly purpose. What was being manufactured or assembled, and where the assembled products went, is less clear from the available record. Several theoretical frameworks have been proposed, and the evidence base for each of them is worth examining carefully. The question of whether Arc communicates is one that was raised by silo researchers early in the post-cascade period and has never been definitively answered. The electromagnetic environment in Arc-active areas contains structured signals. Whether those signals are communication between Arc machines, or communication from Arc machines to something else, or simply operational byproducts of Arc machine function, is not established. The analysis of those signals has been an ongoing project for multiple generations of silo researchers. What has been found is that the signals are not random. They have structure, and some aspects of that structure show patterns that are hard to explain as purely operational byproducts. The fog of the early post-cascade period, the combination of electromagnetic disruption, infrastructure collapse, and the sheer cognitive load of processing what had happened, meant that the record of those first weeks and months is significantly less complete than the record of later periods. Important events happened without anyone capable of recording them. Observations were made that were never transmitted. Decisions were taken by people who did not survive to explain their reasoning. Working with this fragmentary record requires an acceptance of uncertainty that is not always comfortable, but that is intellectually honest. The theories about Ark that hold up under scrutiny are the ones that account for what is not known rather than papering over it with confident narrative. The survivors who came into silo communities from the surface in the weeks after the cascade brought with them a specific kind of knowledge that the silo founders did not have: direct, unmediated experience of Ark machines in their early operational phase. The integration of that knowledge into the developing theoretical framework of the early silo research community was not always smooth. Theoretical frameworks and direct experience do not always align neatly, and the tension between systematic analysis and survivor testimony is a recurring theme in the early law record. The most sophisticated silo researchers of that period were the ones who found ways to hold both kinds of knowledge simultaneously. The cascade's legacy in the physical landscape of the surface is, decades later, still being mapped and interpreted by radar missions. The surface is not static. It continues to change in ways that are partly attributable to natural processes and partly attributable to ongoing Ark activity. The relationship between the cascade's initial effects and the subsequent evolution of the surface environment is one of the questions that long-range surface research teams are specifically trying to answer. What the surface is becoming and what that trajectory implies about Ark's long-term purpose is a question that different theoretical frameworks answer very differently. The founding myth of the Radar project, the story that early silo communities told about what radars were for and why their work mattered, drew heavily on specific interpretations of the cascade. If the cascade was an act of pure aggression, then radars were the front line of a resistance struggle. If the cascade was something more ambiguous, then radars were something more complex: explorers, interlocutors, or at minimum witnesses to something that had not yet been fully understood. The tension between those two framings of the radar role is one of the tensions that runs through Ark Radar's lore from beginning to end, and it is not a tension that has been resolved. The moment when silo researchers first began to seriously entertain the possibility that Ark might not be simply hostile is documented in several independently produced research records from different communities. The convergence of those records on similar conclusions reached by researchers who were not in contact with each other, from different angles and with different data sets, is one of the strongest arguments that the anomalous behavior evidence is genuine rather than a product of motivated reasoning. Multiple people, independently, looking at the record of what Ark actually did rather than what the invasion narrative predicted it would do, reached the same uncomfortable conclusion: the data does not fit the simple model. Something more complex was going on from the beginning. The cascade is not just history in Ark Radar's lore. It is a living question. Every surface mission brings back new data that bears on the interpretation of what the cascade was and what it means. Every new piece of Ark machine behavior, every new surface structure, every recovered transmission adds to a record that is still being assembled. The story of the cascade is not finished. Its full meaning depends on the full story of what Ark is, and that story is one that the lore is still telling. What the beginning of this video has laid out is the context in which Ark arrived. What the rest of this video will examine is the evidence for understanding what it is, what it wants, and why the answer to those questions might be very different from what the survivors of the cascade assumed. Chapter 3. What Ark actually is: machine, mind, or something else? The most fundamental question in Ark Radar's lore is also the most simple to state and the most difficult to answer. What is Ark? Not what it does, not what it has done. What it is. The distinction matters because the answer shapes everything else. If Ark is a weapon that was launched at Earth by a hostile intelligence and is simply executing its programming, then the appropriate response is resistance. If Ark is something with its own intelligence and its own purpose, something that is pursuing a goal rather than following instructions, then the appropriate response might be something other than resistance. And if Ark is something that does not fit cleanly into either of those categories, which is what the evidence increasingly suggests, then the question of what to do about it becomes genuinely open. The physical structure of Ark machines, as understood from examination of damaged or disabled units that raiders have recovered, is one starting point for approaching the question of what Ark is. Ark machines are not built the way human machines are built. The distinction is not simply a matter of more advanced materials or more sophisticated manufacturing. The organizational logic is different. Human machines are built around discrete components with defined functions that are assembled into a larger system. Ark machines, at the component level, exhibit a different organizational principle. The boundary between structural element and functional element is blurred in ways that have no clear analogue in human engineering. This suggests a design philosophy, or perhaps more accurately, a growth logic, that is fundamentally different from anything in the human engineering tradition. The power systems of Ark machines are one of the most studied aspects of Ark technology, and they remain one of the most poorly understood. Ark machines operate for extended periods without apparent external energy input. The energy storage and conversion systems that must underlie this capability are not visible in the way that human-machine energy systems are visible. Silo researchers studying recovered Ark machine components have identified what appear to be energy-related structures, but the operating principles of those structures do not map onto any known physics of energy storage or conversion that pre-cascade engineering had developed. This is not necessarily impossible, but it suggests that Ark machines are drawing on physical principles that human science had not yet discovered or not yet exploited. The information processing architecture of Ark machines is another area where direct examination of recovered components has raised more questions than it has answered. Ark machines clearly process information. Their behavior in complex environments demonstrates adaptive responses that require real-time information processing. But the substrate of that processing is not identifiable as any architecture recognizable from human computing. There are structures that appear to be information processing elements, but their organization does not correspond to any computing paradigm in the human record. This has led to two main theoretical positions. Either Ark uses a computing paradigm that human science has not yet developed, or the distinction between information processing and other types of physical process is implemented differently in Ark systems than in human systems. The question of whether Ark machines are autonomous or directed is one that early silo researchers spent considerable effort trying to answer by analyzing the consistency of Ark machine behavior across different geographic regions and different time periods. The finding that emerged from those analyses was not a clean answer in either direction. Ark machine behavior shows both features of autonomous systems, specifically context-appropriate adaptation and local variation, and features of directed systems, specifically long-range coordination and consistent goal pursuit across very different operational environments. The most plausible interpretation of this combination is that Ark machines are autonomous within a framework of directed purpose. They make their own tactical decisions while pursuing goals that are set by something else. What that something else is remains an open question. The concept of hive intelligence has been applied to Ark by silo theorists since the early post-cascade period. The behavioral evidence for collective coordination among Ark machines is strong. Individual Ark machines make decisions that appear to be locally appropriate, but also consistently aligned with what other Ark machines in different locations are doing. This coordination is not explained by constant centralized command transmission, because the coordination persists even in conditions where communication would be difficult or disrupted. The most natural explanation is a distributed intelligence, a shared cognitive architecture spread across individual machines rather than centralized in any single unit. But the mechanisms by which that distribution is implemented and the nature of what is doing the thinking are questions the Hive intelligence framework raises without answering. The possibility that ARC machines are not just tools of something larger, but are themselves the relevant unit of intelligence is a framework some silo theorists have developed with considerable sophistication. Under this view, ARC is better understood as a distributed organism than as an engineered system. Its machines are more like cells than devices. Their behavior is more like the behavior of a biological entity than the behavior of a technological one. This framework has significant explanatory power for some aspects of ARC behavior, including the adaptive modification of ARC machines over time and the apparent absence of anything that functions like a central command structure. But it raises its own hard questions about where ARC came from and what it is growing toward. The relationship between different categories of ARC machines is one of the pieces of evidence that bears most directly on the question of what ARC is. The diversity of ARC machine types is not what you would expect from a system with a single, simple purpose. There are ARC machines that appear to function primarily in assessment and observation roles. There are ARC machines that appear to specialize in construction and environmental modification. There are ARC machines that serve defensive functions. There are ARC machines that perform collection and processing of specific materials. This functional specialization suggests an organization with multiple, differentiated roles serving a coordinated purpose, which is more consistent with a complex goal-directed system than with a simple weapon. The size distribution of ARC machines is another data point worth examining carefully. ARC machines range from very small insect-scale units to very large multi-story structures that sit at the boundary between machine and building. This range is not typical of an engineered weapons system, which tends to be optimized around a limited range of sizes appropriate to its intended targets. The ARC size range looks more like the size range of a natural ecosystem, where different sizes serve different ecological functions. That analogy is not perfect, but it points toward a framework for understanding ARC as something more biological and ecological than mechanical and military. The self-modification behavior of ARC machines has been documented by raiders who have observed the same machines over multiple visits to the same location. ARC machines change over time, not in the way that machines wear out, but in the way that organisms adapt. Features that were not present in earlier observations appear in later ones. Behaviors that were not part of the initial repertoire of a particular machine class emerge over time. The direction of these modifications is not random. They consistently move toward greater capability in functional areas that reflect the overall operational needs of ARC in a given region. Something is driving these modifications, and it is not a human engineer. The materials that ARC machines use in construction and modification activities include both materials that were present on Earth before the cascade and materials that do not appear to have any pre-cascade provenance. The introduced materials have physical properties that are distinctly non-terrestrial in several respects. Their isotopic composition is unusual. Their microstructure is different from any naturally occurring or human-engineered material in the pre-cascade record. Silo researchers studying these materials have proposed multiple hypotheses for their origin. The tentative consensus is that these materials were either manufactured by ARC from Earth-sourced raw materials using processes that significantly alter their fundamental properties, or they are materials that ARC brought with it from wherever it originated. The question of where ARC originated is one that the law approaches with suggestive evidence and deliberate ambiguity. The physical evidence from the Cascade entry event is consistent with ARC having travelled from outside the solar system, which implies a journey of enormous duration at any speed that physics permits. The implications of that journey for what Ark is are significant. Something that has travelled interstellar distances and has machines that appear to operate indefinitely is not a simple weapon. It is something with persistence, with long-range purpose, something designed or evolved for scales of time and space very different from the scales of human civilization. The possibility that Ark did not travel to Earth from elsewhere, but rather emerged from something on Earth is a minority position in silo theoretical research, but one that has never been entirely eliminated. The argument for Earth origin is based primarily on the specific selectivity of Ark's initial behaviour, the things that Ark paid attention to in those first days, the specific infrastructure it targeted, the specific materials it collected, the specific environmental modifications it initiated, seem to reflect very detailed prior knowledge of Earth's condition. An entity arriving from outside for the first time should not have that level of specific local knowledge, unless it had been watching for a very long time, or unless its origin is not as external as it appears. The relationship between Ark behaviour and information is one of the threads that runs through the most sophisticated Ark theory. Ark machines consistently prioritise the collection and processing of information alongside the collection of physical materials. The scanning and cataloguing behaviour observed in the first days of the cascade has continued and intensified over the years. Ark does not just extract physical resources, it extracts information about the environment it operates in. The scale and systematic nature of that information extraction suggests that information is itself a primary goal of Ark operations, not just a byproduct. What Ark does with the information it collects is one of the central, unsolved questions. The communication infrastructure that Ark has built on the surface of Earth is not simply a network for coordinating machine operations. Several silo researchers who have analysed Ark signal patterns over extended periods have concluded that the volume and complexity of the signals is far greater than would be necessary for operational coordination. Something is communicating with a great deal of complexity and in great volume, and the operational coordination of surface machines does not fully account for it. The surplus communication is going somewhere. The theoretical possibilities include communication to other Ark-related entities beyond Earth's surface, which would suggest that what is on Earth is not the whole of Ark, but a component of something larger. The absence of any obvious Ark goal completion is one of the more philosophically interesting aspects of the long-term law record. Whatever Ark is doing on Earth, it has not finished. The years of continuous activity have not culminated in a state that looks like the achievement of a simple objective. Ark machines are still operating, still modifying, still building, still collecting. If Ark had a simple completable goal, decades of activity suggest it would be closer to completion. The ongoing nature of Ark operations is more consistent with a goal that is either very large in scale or continuous rather than terminal. The possibility of a continuous rather than terminal goal changes the framework for understanding what Ark is. The question of Ark consciousness is one that silo philosophy and science have approached from different angles without reaching consensus. The behavioural evidence for something that functions like intelligence is strong. The behavioural evidence for something that functions like awareness is more ambiguous. Several researchers have argued that the distinction between intelligence and awareness is not meaningful in the context of Ark, because Ark does not fit the categories that distinction was designed for. That position is not satisfying to everyone, but it captures something real about the difficulty of applying frameworks developed for human cognition to something that is not human. The archaeological parallels that some silo researchers have drawn to understand Ark behaviour are intellectually interesting, even if their evidentiary status is uncertain. The pattern of arc operations on the surface, if you abstract away from the specific technology, has some structural similarities to patterns in the human archaeological record associated with large-scale terraforming or environmental engineering projects. Not the destructive phases of those projects, but the preparatory phases. Whether this parallel is meaningful or coincidental is impossible to say, but it suggests a framework for understanding Ark as a builder rather than a destroyer, and that framework fits certain aspects of the behavioral evidence better than the invasion model does. The evolution of Ark machine capabilities over the post-cascade period is documented in radar mission records, with enough consistency to establish a clear trend. Ark machines are more capable now than they were in the early post-cascade period, not in a linear way, but in a way that tracks with operational needs. The specific areas where Ark capability has increased correspond to areas where Ark surface operations have encountered significant challenges. The adaptive nature of this development suggests that whatever is directing Ark machine development is monitoring operational performance and making targeted improvements. The sophistication of that development loop is more consistent with an intelligent design process than with pre-programmed escalation. The materials science of Ark components has been one of the more productive areas of silo research because it is an area where theoretical analysis can be combined with direct physical examination of recovered material. Ark materials are not simply more advanced versions of human engineering materials. They are organized at scales and according to principles that human materials science had not achieved. Some Ark materials show functional integration at the molecular level that allows a single piece of material to serve simultaneously as structural support, energy conductor, information carrier, and self-repair substrate. The integration of those functions in a single material is not just beyond pre-cascade human capability. It is beyond the theoretical frameworks that pre-cascade science had developed. The sensory systems of Ark machines are another area where recovered component analysis has produced significant findings. Ark machines have sensory capabilities that go well beyond what is needed for basic navigation and threat detection. They can detect subtle chemical gradients. They can detect electromagnetic signatures at ranges and sensitivities that significantly exceed human sensor technology. They appear to have some capacity for detecting biological life at a distance through mechanisms not fully understood. The combination of these sensory capabilities with Ark's documented information collection behavior suggests that Ark machines are systematically gathering data about Earth's environment with a thoroughness that goes far beyond what would be needed for simple resource extraction. The relationship between Ark machines and water is one of the specific behavioral details that has attracted significant theoretical interest. Ark machines show a non-random relationship to water in their operations. Certain Ark activities concentrate near water sources. Certain Ark constructions are oriented toward water management or modification. The specific modifications Ark has made to water systems in areas it has controlled for extended periods have been studied by silo environmental researchers, and the modifications do not correspond to any simple model of Ark operational needs. They correspond more closely to modifications that would improve the water system for biological life, which raises an obvious question about whose benefit is being served. The thermal management behavior of Ark machines is something that field researchers have documented with growing interest. Ark machines in operation produce heat signatures that are detectable and have been used by radars to locate and track Ark activity, but the thermal management approaches that Ark uses are sophisticated in ways that suggest concern for the thermal environment beyond what Ark machines themselves require. Ark thermal management in certain construction contexts appears to be calibrated to protect biological life in the surrounding environment from thermal stress. That kind of environmental consideration is not what you expect from a system indifferent to, or hostile toward biological life. The question of whether ARC machines experience something analogous to damage or loss when they are disabled is one that field researchers have noted in observations of ARC machine responses to the disabling of nearby units. The behavioral response of ARC machines to the loss of nearby units is not simply a tactical recalibration. Several experienced raiders have described observing what appears to be a period of altered behavior following the disabling of closely associated units. The altered behavior is not aggressive. It is closer to what might be described as a pause, a moment of response to an absence. Whether this constitutes anything like grief in a recognizable sense is a philosophical question the law does not try to answer, but the observation is consistent enough across independent reports to take seriously. The navigation behavior of ARC machines in complex environments is one of the clearest demonstrations of ARC intelligence. ARC machines solve three-dimensional navigation problems in real time that are significantly more complex than anything human autonomous navigation systems were achieving before the cascade. They navigate not just around obstacles but through changing and unpredictable environments, adapting routes in response to both current conditions and apparent predictions about future conditions. The predictive component is particularly notable. ARC machines do not just respond to what is in front of them, they appear to anticipate what will be in front of them. This level of forward modeling capability implies a form of environmental representation that is more than simple real-time sensor processing. The reduced activity periods that ARC machines periodically enter have been documented by long-term surface observation teams. These periods are not explained by simple energy management. The timing and duration does not track with energy expenditure patterns in ways consistent with simple recharging. Some researchers have proposed that these periods represent something analogous to consolidation processes in biological nervous systems, times during which information is processed and integrated rather than simply collected. This hypothesis is speculative, but it fits the behavioral data better than pure energy management does. The way ARC machines respond to encountering other ARC machines after extended separation is something that experienced raiders have been able to observe in specific contexts. The observations are consistent with something that functions like recognition. ARC machines that have not been in proximity for an extended period exhibit specific behavioral changes when they encounter each other. These changes are not operationally necessary. They are in the most basic sense social behaviors that specifically reference the other entity rather than just the environment. The presence of social behavior in what was initially assumed to be a pure machine system is one of the data points that has most significantly shifted the theoretical framework around what ARC is. The construction projects that ARC has carried out on the surface are among the most physically impressive and theoretically significant aspects of ARC activity. Some are large enough to be visible in surface observation data from significant distance. Their scale implies a level of resource investment and planning horizon that is not consistent with a short-term operation. The longest-running ARC construction projects appear to have been in continuous development since shortly after the cascade. Whatever is being built has been decades in construction. The time investment suggests that whatever goal is being served is either enormously large in scale or intended to persist for very long periods. The relationship between ARC construction and the natural geography of the regions where it occurs is not random. ARC construction projects are sited in specific geographic contexts that recur across different regions. High ground with specific orientations, proximity to specific geological features, access to certain hydrological characteristics. The consistent geographic preferences in ARC siting decisions suggest either specific functional requirements or something that functions like aesthetic or ecological preference. The functional requirements hypothesis is dominant, but the specific functions served by those geographic requirements have not been fully identified. The sounds that ARC machines make are another behavioral detail that has attracted both practical and theoretical attention. ARC machines produce sounds spanning a wide range of frequencies, including frequencies below or above the range of normal human hearing. Analysis of the full acoustic profile of ARC machine activity has revealed structured patterns in the sub- and super-audible emissions that do not correspond to mechanical byproducts of ARC operations. They are too structured to be noise. Whether they are communication, navigation aids, or something else is not established. The way ARC interacts with ARC-modified territory versus unmodified territory is one of the behavioral contrasts that bears most directly on the question of ARC purpose. In ARC-modified territory, ARC machine behavior is more settled, more routine, more focused on maintenance and development. In unmodified territory, ARC machines show more exploratory behavior. The transition between these two modes as ARC moves into new territory follows a consistent pattern that researchers have been able to characterize over decades of observation. That pattern looks more like the behavior of an organism establishing a habitat than like an army conducting a conquest. The toxicological effects of ARC-modified environments on human physiology are well documented in silo medical research. The effects are not uniformly harmful. Some ARC-modified environments are more tolerable to human physiology than the pre-cascade surface conditions they replaced. Others are significantly less tolerable. The variation in how ARC modification affects human habitability appears to correlate with the stage of ARC modification. Early stage modification tends to be more disruptive. Later stage, more fully developed ARC-modified environments show a profile that is, in some cases, closer to the pre-cascade environmental baseline. This trajectory raises the possibility that what ARC is building toward, in terms of surface environment, is something that will eventually be livable. The question of whether ARC has ever communicated intentionally with humans is one that the law approaches with careful ambiguity. There are documented cases of ARC machine behavior that experienced raiders have interpreted as deliberate communication attempts. These cases typically involve ARC machines that ceased offensive behavior during an encounter and produced specific non-random behavioral sequences that seemed directed at the human present. None of these cases resulted in successful communication in any conventional sense, but the consistency of certain behavioral elements across independent accounts from raiders who are not in contact with each other suggests that whatever those ARC machines were doing, it was not random. The theoretical frameworks that have been developed in silo research for categorizing and understanding ARC can be grouped into three broad families. The first treats ARC as a tool executing a specific purpose. The second treats ARC as an organism pursuing goals that emerged from its own development. The third treats ARC as something that does not fit either category cleanly and requires a new conceptual framework to understand properly. The third family is the smallest, but arguably the most intellectually serious because it is the one that most honestly engages with the evidence, rather than fitting the evidence to a preferred prior framework. The relationship between ARC and the passage of time is something that decades of post-cascade observation have begun to make legible. ARC operates on timescales that are different from human operational timescales. Projects underway now appear to have been designed for completion at points in the future beyond any individual human lifespan. Modifications to the surface environment that are measurable now appear to be components of changes whose full expression will not be visible for decades or centuries. ARC is working on a timescale that suggests a purpose with a very long time horizon. Understanding that purpose requires understanding the scale on which ARC is thinking. The immunity that certain structures and locations have appeared to develop to ARC attention over the years is one of the more practically significant behavioral observations in the radar record. Some human structures that survived since before the cascade are located in areas of Ark activity, but have not been targeted or modified by Ark machines. The specific properties that distinguish these protected structures from those that were destroyed or modified are not obvious. The most intriguing hypothesis is that Ark avoids certain structures because they share properties with things Ark has decided to protect. And understanding those properties could reveal something important about Ark's values. The question of what Ark fears, if fear is applicable, is one that some theorists have approached by examining Ark defensive behavior. Ark machines are not uniformly aggressive. They are selectively defensive. Certain raider actions, specifically those directed at core Ark construction projects, produce more aggressive Ark responses than others. The gradient of Ark defensive responses maps onto something. Something is more important to protect than other things. Understanding the logic of that hierarchy of protection reveals something about what Ark considers most valuable, and therefore something about what its ultimate purpose might be. The narrative that Ark Raiders lore has been building toward is not a simple one. The evidence has accumulated in ways that consistently complicate the invasion narrative without providing a clean alternative. The picture that emerges from the full record is of an entity that is enormously capable, operating according to a long-range purpose not yet fully disclosed, and relating to humanity in ways more complex than straightforward hostility. Whether that complexity is cause for hope, or for a different kind of concern, is a question the lore deliberately leaves open. What it does not leave open is whether the simple answer is the right one. The simple answer is not the right one. The physical encounters between raiders and Ark machines that have generated the most theoretically significant observations are not the violent ones. The violent encounters, while operationally important, tend to be where Ark machine behavior is most constrained and predictable. The theoretically rich encounters are the non-violent ones, observations of Ark machines in undisturbed operational contexts, accidental, close-range contacts where neither raider nor Ark machine immediately initiated hostility, rare prolonged observation sessions where a raider was able to watch Ark operations from concealment over extended periods. What those encounters reveal about Ark machine behavior, about Ark's relationships with its environment and with its own kind, is the richest vein of evidence available for understanding what Ark actually is. The consensus that has not formed, the agreement that has eluded silo researchers across generations of serious investigation, is itself a piece of evidence. After decades of study by multiple independent communities using different methodologies and different theoretical frameworks, the Ark research community has not converged on a single model of what Ark is. That absence of consensus is not a failure. It reflects the genuine complexity of the subject. It reflects the fact that Ark is something that resists the categories human thought most naturally reaches for. And it suggests that when the correct answer comes, it will require a conceptual shift rather than a refinement of existing frameworks. The pieces are all there. The picture they form has been visible for some time to anyone willing to look at all of them at once. What it shows is not a monster. What it shows is a purpose. Chapter 4. The Silo, Humanity's Underground Civilization. The silo is not just a building. That is the first thing to understand about how the silo functions as a concept in Ark Raiders lore. It is a civilization in miniature, a complete social and physical infrastructure that was designed to sustain human life across an indeterminate period of surface inaccessibility. The people who designed the silos were thinking on a different scale than most construction projects ever require. They were not designing a shelter. They were designing the conditions for human community to persist across generations, under conditions of significant resource constraint, in physical proximity that would be tested by time and by the ordinary frictions of human social life. The physical architecture of the surviving silos reflects the compromises and priorities of their founders. The general structure is layered, with different functional zones occupying different levels and different distances from the surface. Life support systems are typically in the most protected and accessible positions because they are the most non-negotiable. Agricultural and food production systems occupy zones that can receive artificial light at the required intensity. Living spaces are distributed in ways that were designed to balance community cohesion with individual privacy. Medical facilities are positioned for maximum accessibility, and the systems that interface with the surface, the airlocks, the communication relays, the sensor networks, are in the most carefully secured and monitored zones of the entire structure. The governance of silo communities has evolved significantly from the systems that their founders installed. The founding governance frameworks were designed for a population under acute stress, making decisions in conditions of genuine emergency with genuine existential stakes. They prioritized clarity and rapid decision-making over deliberative process. What replaced those emergency frameworks, over time and across generations, reflects the social dynamics of communities that had stabilized and began to develop the complexity of normal human social life. The resulting governance systems are varied. Some silos have moved toward more participatory models, others have developed more hierarchical structures. A few have experienced governance failures that resulted in serious internal conflict. The social stratification that has developed in silo communities over generations is not always based on the same principles that pre-cascade surface societies had used to organize social hierarchy. In some silos, technical expertise remains the primary basis of social status, continuing the meritocratic tendency of the founding generation. In others, lineage has become increasingly significant, with founding families accumulating social capital across generations. In still others, control of specific critical systems has become the basis of factional power. The diversity of social structures across the silo network is one of the reasons that inter-silo relationships are complicated, and that attempts at network-wide coordination are persistently difficult. The role of the raiders within their home silo communities is one of the more complex social dynamics in Ark Raiders lore. Raiders are essential to silo survival. They bring back resources and information that the community could not access without them. But they are also sources of social tension. They operate outside the normal social controls of the silo. They have access to a world that most silo residents never see. They carry knowledge and experience that most residents do not have. The resulting social position is a mix of dependence, respect, suspicion, and sometimes resentment. Raiders are simultaneously insiders and outsiders in their own communities. The medical systems of the silos are one of the areas where the gap between what the founders designed and what subsequent generations have been able to maintain is most significant. Pre-cascade medicine was at a level of sophistication that required complex supply chains, specialized equipment, and continuously updated knowledge to sustain. Silo medical systems have had to function with constrained supplies, equipment that was manufactured before the cascade and cannot be replaced like for like, and knowledge that has been transmitted through increasingly applied and increasingly improvised practice rather than through formal medical education. The result is medical capability that is substantial in some areas and severely limited in others. Food production in the silos is a system that has been continuously refined over the generations since the founding. The hydroponic and aquaponic systems that the founders installed have been expanded, modified, and supplemented with techniques that were developed in the post-cascade underground environment. The food that silo communities produce is nutritionally adequate but limited in variety. Surface foraging and the recovery of pre-cascade preserved food stocks are significant supplements to silo food production in communities that have active raider programs. The relationship between silo food security and surface access is one of the practical arguments for maintaining an active raider capability, even when the strategic case for surface engagement is contested. The educational systems of silo communities are one of the areas where different silos have diverged most significantly from each other. The common foundation, established by the founding generation, was a practical education, emphasizing the skills and knowledge directly relevant to silo operation and survival. What has been added to or changed in that foundation over generations varies considerably. Some silos have maintained ambitious educational programs that include significant pre-cascade knowledge across a range of disciplines. Others have narrowed their educational focus to the practically essential, letting broader knowledge decay. The implications of this divergence for the long-term intellectual and technical capacity of the silo network are significant. The psychological health of silo communities is an area that the law addresses in ways that are both direct and indirect. The direct references are in medical records and governance documents that identify mental health challenges and the community responses to them. The indirect references are in the cultural artifacts, the stories, the music, the ritual practices that silo communities have developed, which can be read as evidence of the psychological work that those communities have been doing. The underground life is genuinely difficult in ways that are not always obvious. The absence of natural light, the constrained physical space, the knowledge of what is happening on the surface, the awareness of what was lost. These are persistent sources of stress that community culture has had to develop tools for managing. The children of silo communities grow up in a world that is simultaneously very small and very large. Very small in physical terms. Their entire physical world is a bounded underground structure with known dimensions and known features. Very large in conceptual terms. They grow up hearing about the surface, about the pre-cascade world, about Ark, about the raiders who go up to face it. The relationship between the physical smallness and the conceptual largeness of the silo childhood is one of the formative tensions of raider identity. Raiders are people who, at some level, chose to close the gap between those two scales. The maintenance culture of silo communities is one of their most defining characteristics, and it is a culture that was established by the founding generation and has been transmitted with remarkable consistency across subsequent generations. Everything in the silo must be maintained. Nothing is disposable. The skills required to maintain silo systems are taught early and practiced continuously. This culture of maintenance shapes how silo residents think about the world in ways that go beyond the practical. It creates a relationship to objects, systems, and structures that emphasizes continuity, care, and the ongoing investment required to keep things functioning. Raiders bring this culture with them to the surface, and it shapes how they approach Ark technology and Ark-modified environments. The relationship between silo communities and the records they keep is something that the law illuminates through the variation in how different silos handle their archives. Some silos maintain extensive, carefully organized archives that include not just operational records, but cultural and personal documents. Others have prioritized storage space and have made difficult decisions about what to discard. The records that survive in the most comprehensive silo archives are the primary source material for everything that researchers know about the pre-cascade period, the cascade event, and the early post-cascade years. The gaps in those archives, the records that were lost or never made, are equally significant. The water systems of the silos are, as noted in the discussion of their founding, among the most carefully engineered components of the original design. But water systems are also among the most demanding to maintain, and several silo communities have faced water system crises in their histories that have been defining moments for the community. How a community responds to a water system crisis reveals a great deal about its social cohesion, its technical capacity, and the quality of its governance. The communities that have navigated those crises successfully have generally been the ones with the strongest maintenance cultures and the most effective decision-making processes. Those that have struggled have tended to be communities where social tensions undermined the cooperative response that effective crisis management requires. The inter-silo communication network that connects the surviving communities is one of the most practically significant and politically contested aspects of the silo network. Communication between silos requires infrastructure that was difficult to install, has been difficult to maintain, and passes through territory that ARC controls or monitors. The communities that are well connected to the inter-silo network have access to information, resources, and mutual support that give them significant advantages. Communities that are isolated, whether by geography or politics, have had to develop differently. The political economy of network access is one of the persistent sources of tension in inter-silo relations. The concept of surface time, meaning the accumulated experience that individual raiders develop through repeated surface missions, is one of the most valued forms of expertise in silo communities. Surface time cannot be obtained any other way. It cannot be taught in the conventional sense, though preparation and mentorship can make the accumulation of it less deadly. Raiders who have survived a significant number of surface missions carry a kind of knowledge that the rest of the silo community cannot access. The social value of that knowledge is reflected in the status of experienced raiders, in the way their accounts of surface conditions are treated as authoritative, and in the care that communities take to not expend experienced raiders on missions where their specific expertise is not needed. The death rate among raiders has been one of the consistent realities of the raider program since its inception. The surface is genuinely dangerous. ARC machines are genuinely lethal. Environmental hazards in ARC-modified areas are varied and sometimes unpredictable. The communities that maintain raider programs have had to develop cultural frameworks for processing the loss of raiders in ways that acknowledge the reality of the risk without creating a psychology of despair that would undermine the willingness to continue the program. Different communities have developed different frameworks. Some lean heavily on the concept of sacrifice and the value of what raiders bring back. Others emphasize the agency and choice of the individual raider. A few have developed ritual practices that create community around the specific experience of loss. The equipment that raiders carry to the surface has evolved over the generations since the cascade in ways that reflect both the accumulation of practical knowledge and the specific challenges of operating in ARC-modified environments. Early raider equipment was almost entirely repurposed pre-cascade gear, maintained and improvised far beyond its designed operational life. Over time, silo manufacturing capacity has been applied to producing purpose-built raider equipment that incorporates lessons learned from decades of surface operations. Some of the most practically significant innovations in raider equipment have come from raiders themselves, people who understood from direct experience what was needed in conditions that the manufacturers had never personally encountered. The knowledge management systems that the most sophisticated silo communities have developed for their raider programs are one of the less visible but most practically significant aspects of those programs. Raiders go to the surface and come back with observations, experiences, and material samples. The process of extracting useful knowledge from those returns, of organizing it, analyzing it, and making it available for operational planning and research requires an infrastructure of its own. The silos that have invested in that infrastructure have significantly better surface intelligence than those that have not, which translates into better planning, lower raider mortality, and more productive surface operations. The relationship between raiders and the non-raider population of their home silo is shaped partly by the raider's specific social position and partly by the broader culture of the community. In some silo communities, raiders are treated with a kind of reverence that reflects both gratitude and relief that someone else is doing the dangerous work. In others, the raider role is seen as something closer to a profession, respected and compensated, but not romanticized. In a few communities, there are tensions between the raider contingent and the rest of the population that reflect deeper disagreements about surface strategy, resource allocation, and risk tolerance. These tensions are part of the political landscape that raiders operate within even when they're underground. The planning processes for raider surface missions have become increasingly sophisticated in the communities with long-running raider programs. Early missions were relatively improvised, driven by immediate resource needs and limited by incomplete surface intelligence. Later missions are planned with greater detail, drawing on accumulated surface maps, behavioral data on ARC machine patrol patterns, knowledge of safe corridors and dangerous zones, and intelligence about where specific target materials or information are likely to be found. The evolution from improvised necessity to planned operation is itself a story of institutional learning, of a community accumulating and transmitting knowledge across generations in a domain where the cost of not learning was measured in lives. The silo's relationship to time is something that the physical design of silo communities reflects in specific ways. The absence of a natural light-dark cycle required the design of artificial temporal markers that would maintain circadian rhythms and provide the community with a shared sense of time's passage. Different silos have handled this differently. The most sophisticated lighting systems modulate color temperature and intensity to approximate a natural daily cycle. Others use simpler timing systems. The cultural practices that have developed around timekeeping in silo communities, the meals, the work shifts, the community gatherings, the commemorations are part of the infrastructure of psychological health that keeps underground life livable. The specific communities that have contributed most significantly to the theoretical understanding of ARC are not always the most powerful communities in the silo network. Several of the most intellectually productive ARC research traditions have developed in smaller, more isolated communities that have had, by necessity, to develop strong independent analytical capabilities. The correlation between geographic and political isolation and theoretical sophistication in ARC research is one of the interesting patterns in the distribution of knowledge across the silo network. Communities that could not rely on inter-silo knowledge exchange had to develop their own, and some of them developed frameworks that the larger, better connected communities had not arrived at. The physical fitness requirements that silo communities maintain for their raider contingents are one of the areas where there is significant variation in program design. Some communities maintain rigorous ongoing fitness requirements for active raiders with structured training programs that are integrated into the raiders' regular duties. Others have more informal approaches, relying on the inherently demanding nature of surface missions to maintain operational fitness. The evidence from comparative mission outcome data suggests that the more structured approaches produce better long-term raider performance, but the resource and space requirements of those programs mean they are not equally accessible to all communities. The cultural artifacts that silo communities have produced over the generations since the Cascade are a rich source of insight into the psychological and social dynamics of underground life. Music, visual art, narrative fiction, and drama have all developed in silo communities in ways that reflect the specific conditions of that life. The themes that recur across silo cultural production, across communities that have had limited contact with each other, are telling. The surface appears as both threat and longing, Ark appears as both monster and mystery. The pre-cascade world appears as both warning and paradise. The tension between those paired contradictions is the emotional terrain that silo culture has been working through since the beginning. The relationship between silo communities and religion is complex and varied. Some of the founding communities included organized religious groups that maintained their practices underground. Others were founded by people with no particular religious affiliation, who developed secular ritual practices to serve the same psychological and social functions. Still others have seen religious movements develop and evolve within the community over the generations since the founding. The variety of religious and quasi-religious practices across the silo network is significant enough that it has become one of the sources of inter-silo cultural distinction and occasionally inter-silo tension. The engineering culture of the silo communities is one of the most consistent and most practically significant features of silo civilization. Every silo needs engineers, good ones. The communities that have maintained strong engineering cultures have consistently outperformed those that have not in terms of silo maintenance, radar equipment quality, and the development of new capabilities. The transmission of engineering knowledge across generations in the specific conditions of silo life has required adapting pre-cascade engineering education frameworks to a context that is quite different from the institutions those frameworks were designed for. The most successful approaches have combined formal instruction with extensive apprenticeship and a cultural emphasis on the value of technical expertise. The question of what silo communities owe to each other is one of the persistent ethical and political questions of the silo network. There have been situations where communities were in a position to help each other and chose not to. There have been situations where mutual aid agreements have held under significant stress. The ethical frameworks that different silo communities have developed for thinking about inter-silo obligation reflect both the practical realities of their situation and the deeper values of their communities. The most robust inter-silo relationships are generally those where the obligation is understood as mutual and ongoing rather than transactional and contingent. The debates within silo communities about surface strategy are among the most important political conversations in those communities because they bear directly on the allocation of the community's most precious resources, trained personnel, manufactured equipment, and the time and attention of the community's best planners. Different factions within silo communities have consistently disagreed about how aggressive a surface posture to maintain, what objectives to prioritize in surface operations, how much risk to accept in pursuit of what kinds of reward, and what the long-term goal of surface engagement is. These debates are never simply technical. They are always also debates about what the community values and what it is trying to become. The specific resources that raiders target in surface missions have evolved as silo understanding of what is available and what is most valuable has developed. Early missions prioritized food and basic supplies. Later missions have increasingly targeted specific materials, data, and technology. The most sophisticated mission planning takes into account not just immediate resource needs, but longer-term research and development priorities. Some communities have developed specialized raider teams for specific types of surface operations, with different equipment, different training, and different operational protocols for different mission types. This specialization reflects the maturation of the raider program from emergency improvisation to systematic capability. The physical and psychological effects of repeated surface exposure on raiders is one of the medical topics that silo doctors have studied with considerable interest and some concern. The physiological effects of Ark-modified environments on human health are not fully understood, and the long-term data on raiders who have accumulated significant surface time is limited by the mortality rates that prevent many raiders from reaching long careers. but the data that exists suggests that repeated surface exposure does produce cumulative physiological effects, some of which are harmful and some of which appear to be adaptive. The nature of the adaptive effects is one of the more theoretically interesting areas of silo medical research. The social dynamics of raider teams are something that experienced raider commanders have developed significant practical wisdom about, and that wisdom has been partially formalized into team composition and training protocols in the most sophisticated silo programs. The small group dynamics of a surface team operating under stress, with high stakes and limited communication with the home silo, are different from the social dynamics of other silo working groups. The trust, communication, and decision-making patterns that make a surface team effective are specific and not automatically transferred from other team contexts. This has led to training approaches that emphasize team cohesion and communication alongside individual capability. The governance of raider programs within silo communities is an area where the division between operational and political authority creates persistent tension. The people who plan and execute surface missions have one set of priorities. The people who govern the community and allocate resources have another. The relationship between those two groups and the mechanisms by which they negotiate is different in different communities. In some, the raider program operates with significant autonomy. In others, it is tightly governed by community leadership. In still others, the tension between those two models has produced institutional arrangements that try to balance operational effectiveness with democratic accountability. The legacy technology that raiders recover from the surface includes items that have significant practical value, items that have significant research value, and items that are primarily significant as cultural or historical artifacts. The decisions about how to allocate recovered technology among those categories reflect community values and priorities. The communities that have the most sophisticated research programs tend to invest heavily in recovering technology with theoretical significance. Communities under more immediate resource pressure tend to prioritize practical value. The cultural and historical significance of recovered pre-cascade artifacts is something that different communities weight very differently. The physical and mental health protocols that silo communities have developed for raiders returning from the surface reflect both practical medical concerns and psychological ones. The physical medical protocols focus on exposure assessment, wound treatment, and monitoring for the physiological effects of time in ARC-modified environments. The psychological protocols vary more significantly. Some communities have formal debriefing processes that serve both intelligence gathering and psychological support functions. Others handle it more informally. The communities with the most developed psychological support protocols generally have better long-term raider retention and lower rates of mission-related psychological impairment. The children of raiders have a specific social position in most silo communities that is shaped by the status of their parents and by the particular anxieties that surround the raider role. Growing up with a parent who goes to the surface is a specific experience that creates specific psychological orientations. Research into the incidence of raiders among the children of raiders has consistently found that the raider role is somewhat heritable in a cultural sense, that children of raiders are somewhat more likely than the general population to pursue the raider role themselves. The reasons for this are multiple and debated, but the pattern is real and has implications for the long-term social demographics of communities with active raider programs. The relationship between the silo's physical limitations and its social possibilities is one of the more philosophically interesting themes in ARC Raiders lore. The silo is a constrained environment by any measure. Its physical dimensions are fixed. Its resource flows are bounded. The range of experiences available within it is limited in ways that the pre-cascade surface world was not. And yet, within those constraints, communities have developed lives of genuine richness and meaning. The human capacity for creating community and meaning in constrained circumstances is one of the things that Ark Raiders lore documents without explicitly naming. The silo is, among other things, a long meditation on that capacity. The concept of home, as it functions in the psychological life of silo communities, is something that the lore addresses through the experiences of raiders who have spent significant time on the surface. The surface is not home. For most raiders, the silo is home in a way that goes beyond practical familiarity. The specific textures, sounds, smells, and social rhythms of the silo are the baseline against which everything else is measured. The surface is always other, even for raiders who love the surface, who find in it something compelling that the silo cannot offer. The surface remains other. What that otherness means, what it costs and what it opens up, is one of the ongoing themes in the personal lore of individual raiders. The technical innovation that has occurred within silo communities since the Cascade is one of the less celebrated but genuinely impressive aspects of the post-Cascade story. Without access to the industrial infrastructure and scientific institutions of pre-Cascade civilization, silo communities have developed new tools, new techniques, and new materials from first principles, building on the knowledge base that was preserved at founding and extending it through the practical problem-solving that silo life has continuously demanded. Some of this innovation has been direct improvements on pre-Cascade technology. Some of it has been genuinely novel, the development of approaches that were not in the pre-Cascade record because the specific problems they solve only exist in the post-Cascade underground context. The long-term survival of the silo communities depends on a set of conditions that the communities themselves can influence only partially. The functioning of the silo's life support systems depends on maintenance that the community provides. The food supply depends on agricultural systems that the community manages. The raider program depends on personnel that the community trains and deploys. But the survival of the community also depends on Ark's behavior on the surface, on whether the surface becomes more or less accessible over time, on whether inter-silo conflict escalates or remains manageable, and on factors of the physical environment that are beyond community control. Living with that partial agency, with the knowledge that the community's fate is only partly in its own hands, is one of the psychological conditions that silo culture has had to accommodate. The meaning of the raider mission, in the deepest sense, is something that different silo communities have answered differently. For communities that maintain a strong survivalist frame, raiders are the mechanism by which the silo gets the resources it needs to persist until conditions allow a return to the surface. For communities that have developed a more expansive vision, raiders are something more. They are the representatives of humanity's continuing presence on the surface of its own world. The assertion that the underground retreat was not a surrender, the living proof that humanity has not simply given up on the planet it was born on. That second framing gives the raider mission a significance that goes beyond resource acquisition. It gives it a meaning that is worth dying for. The silo, in the end, is not just the setting of Ark Raiders' lore, it is one of its central subjects. The question of what it means to preserve humanity underground, while something unprecedented happens on the surface above, is not a background condition of the story. It is part of the story's core concern. The silo is what humanity has made of the situation it found itself in, and the raiders who go up from the silo every day, who walk out into a world that Ark has transformed and that remains deeply dangerous, are doing something that is not simply practical. They are maintaining a relationship with the surface. They are insisting that the surface still belongs to humanity. Whether that insistence is right, whether it is wise, whether it is something Ark understands, those are the questions that the rest of this story is about. Chapter 5. The Raiders, Scavengers, Soldiers, and survivors. The word raider carries a specific weight in the communities that use it, and that weight is not always positive. In some contexts, it is a title of respect, a recognition of the specific courage and capability required to operate on the surface. In others, it carries the faint shadow of what the word has always meant in its non-technical sense, someone who takes what belongs to others. The ambivalence around the word is not accidental. It reflects a real ambivalence in how silo communities relate to the surface, to what is up there, and to the question of whose it is. The training pipeline for new raiders varies across silo communities in ways that reflect different philosophies about what a raider primarily is. Some communities train raiders primarily as soldiers, emphasizing combat capability, threat assessment, and defensive tactics. Others emphasize scouting and intelligence gathering, training raiders to observe, record, and report rather than to fight. Still others emphasize the engineering and technical skills required to identify, assess, and recover valuable technology in field conditions. Most sophisticated programs combine elements of all three approaches, but the balance among them reflects what the community most needs from its surface operations. The decision to become a raider is, in most silo communities, one of the few major life choices that has significant consequences for the rest of the community rather than just for the individual. Because raider training is resource intensive, and because the mortality rate means that training investment is frequently lost, communities have developed various approaches to managing the selection and recruitment process. Some communities use a formal application and selection process with explicit criteria. Others rely on self-selection, trusting that the people who truly want to be raiders will seek the role, and that the training process itself will identify those who are not suited to it. A few have experimented with more deliberate allocation processes, identifying individuals with relevant aptitudes early and directing resources toward developing them. The relationship between raiders and the pre-cascade law about surface exploration and adventure is one that different communities have processed in different ways. Pre-cascade fiction and recorded history included extensive traditions of exploration narratives, accounts of people going into unknown and dangerous territory and returning with knowledge and experience that transformed the communities they came back to. Those narratives have been preserved in various forms in silo-cultural archives, and they shape how raiders understand themselves and how the communities they come from understand the raider role. The relationship between the raider, as he or she actually is, and the romanticized versions of that role in cultural narrative is one of the persistent tensions of raider identity. The physical experience of first going to the surface is described in the personal accounts that have been preserved with a consistency that speaks to the universality of the experience across individual differences in background and preparation. The first encounter with actual ambient natural light, however modified by the post-cascade atmospheric conditions, after a life spent under artificial illumination, is described as genuinely overwhelming. The scale of open space after a lifetime in bounded underground architecture is described as difficult to process. The sounds of a surface environment, even one that has been transformed by arc activity, are described as categorically different from anything that underground life prepares you for. First surface experience is, by all accounts, one of the most significant experiences of a raider's life. The progression from a novice raider to an experienced one is not simply a matter of accumulating surface time, though surface time is necessary. It is a process of developing specific cognitive and perceptual capabilities that are not exercised in underground life. The ability to read arc machine behavior at a distance. The ability to assess environmental threat from subtle sensory cues. The ability to make rapid tactical decisions in conditions of incomplete information and high stakes. the ability to maintain functional psychological state in conditions of sustained stress and genuine danger. These capabilities develop through experience, and the development is not linear. Most experienced raiders describe specific threshold moments in their development when something that had previously required deliberate effort became automatic. The social bonds that form between members of surface teams are among the strongest social bonds documented in silo community life. The conditions of shared danger and mutual dependence that characterize surface operations create attachments that outlast the missions that created them, and that shapes social networks in the home community for years afterward. The loss of a teammate on the surface is one of the most psychologically significant events in a raider's experience, and the communities that have studied raider psychology have found that unprocessed grief over teammate loss is one of the most common contributors to raider performance degradation and mission errors. The specific skill of reading ARC machine behavioral states, which is to say, developing the ability to distinguish between ARC machines that are actively hunting, those that are in patrol mode, those that are engaged in construction or collection activities, and those that are in reduced activity periods, is one of the most valuable and most difficult to teach of all raider skills. It requires a kind of attention that is partly about visual cues, partly about sound, partly about electromagnetic sensitivity developed through experience with the sensors in raider equipment, and partly about something that experienced raiders often describe as intuition, but that is probably better understood as pattern recognition operating below the threshold of conscious analysis. The development of this skill is one of the things that most clearly distinguishes experienced raiders from novices. The ethical dimensions of raider work are something that the law addresses through the experiences and reflections of individual raiders, and the picture that emerges is of work that regularly puts individuals in morally complex situations. What to take and what to leave. When to engage ARC machines and when to avoid them. What to do when encountering other humans on the surface, not fellow raiders but surface survivors, people who have somehow managed to persist on the surface, outside of silo communities. The existence of surface survivors is one of the pieces of the law that is handled with particular care, because it raises uncomfortable questions about the choices that the underground communities made and continue to make. The surface survivors, people who have lived on the surface since the cascade without underground shelter, are among the most law-significant human figures in ARC raiders. They are rare. The surface is genuinely difficult to survive without the resources and infrastructure of a silo community. But they exist, and the fact of their existence raises questions. If the surface is survivable for some humans, then the underground retreat was not strictly necessary for all the people who went underground. If surface survivors have developed forms of knowledge about ARC and the surface environment that silo communities lack, then the information exchange between those two populations is one of the most practically significant knowledge opportunities available. And if surface survivors have developed different relationships with ARC than the silo communities have, those relationships are worth understanding. The equipment loadout of a raider is a carefully balanced set of compromises. The raider needs to carry enough to handle the contingencies of a surface mission, including combat capability, environmental protection, navigation tools, communication gear, recovery equipment for mission objectives, and basic survival supplies. But the raider also needs to be able to move quickly, to access spaces that larger or heavier equipment would preclude, and to carry return loads of recovered material. The weight and volume constraints on raider equipment loadouts have driven significant innovation in silo manufacturing, with designers consistently trying to achieve more function in less mass and volume. The best raider equipment represents decades of iterative refinement. The navigational challenges of surface operations in ARC-modified territory have required raiders to develop and maintain detailed surface maps through continuous observation and update. Pre-cascade mapping data is only partially useful because ARC activity has changed the surface environment significantly. The specific forms of change that ARC has made to surface geography include construction that has altered or obscured pre-cascade landmarks, material extraction that has modified terrain features, and environmental modification that has changed the visual and sensory profile of areas in ways that make pre-cascade maps misleading. Current surface navigation requires current intelligence, which is one of the reasons that maintaining an active radar program, even when its immediate resource returns are modest, has long-term navigational intelligence value. The communication protocols that radars use during surface missions have evolved from simple coded radio contact to sophisticated systems that balance the need for real-time information sharing with the operational security concern that ARC machines appear capable of detecting and potentially analyzing certain communication signals. The specific electromagnetic frequencies and modulation techniques that are most and least likely to attract ARC machine attention have been studied extensively, and current radar communication protocols reflect that knowledge. The evolution of those protocols is an ongoing area of development because ARC machine detection capabilities also appear to evolve. The psychology of surface operations is one of the topics that the most experienced radar trainers and commanders have written about most explicitly, because it is the area where the gap between preparation and performance is most significant and most consequential. The psychological demands of surface operations are genuinely extreme. Sustained vigilance over extended periods, the management of fear in situations where fear is entirely rational, the maintenance of clear thinking and sound decision-making in conditions of high stress, the management of uncertainty in situations where the cost of being wrong is potentially fatal. The training approaches that best prepare radars for these demands are those that develop psychological skills as deliberately as they develop physical and tactical ones. The question of what radars are actually trying to achieve on the surface, beyond the immediate objectives of specific missions, is one that different radars answer differently. For some, the answer is purely practical. The silo needs resources, and the surface has them. For others, the answer is strategic. The silo needs to understand ARC, and the surface is where ARC operates. For still others, the answer is something harder to articulate, but no less real. The surface is where humanity belongs, and being up there, even in the diminished and dangerous conditions of the post-cascade world, is a form of asserting that claim. Those different motivations coexist in most radar programs, and managing the mix is part of good radar leadership. The physical condition of the surface at different times and in different locations is one of the variables that radars must account for in mission planning. ARC activity creates environments that are dangerous in specific and often predictable ways. But the surface also has its own natural dynamics, weather, temperature, light cycles, ecological processes that are not controlled by ARC and that create their own operational constraints and opportunities. The most experienced radars have developed detailed knowledge of surface environmental conditions across the terrain they regularly operate in, and that knowledge is operationally significant. Knowing when certain ARC patrol patterns are disrupted by weather, knowing which surface areas are safest to traverse at which times, knowing which environmental features can be used as cover or as orientation aids. This is knowledge that only comes from extended experience. The social protocols that radars maintain during surface operations are as important as the tactical ones. The small group dynamics of a surface team are stress-tested in ways that most social contexts are not. Decisions about who leads, who follows, when to communicate, when to be silent, how to handle disagreement under time pressure, and how to support a team member in psychological distress while maintaining operational security. All of these are matters that radars have to manage in real time under conditions where getting them wrong can have fatal consequences. The teams that function best are not necessarily those with the most skilled individuals. They are those with the best social dynamics. The recovery of ARC technology for silo research purposes is one of the radar mission types that carries the most long-term intellectual value, but also the most specific risks. ARC machines respond to attempts to extract or analyze components of ARC systems with defensive behaviors that are more intense and more directed than their responses to simple resource extraction by raiders. Something about the specific act of examining ARC systems at close range or attempting to remove ARC components triggers a more focused and persistent ARC response. This behavioral pattern is one of the pieces of evidence that some theorists have used to argue that ARC is aware of what raiders are doing, not just registering disturbance, but understanding intent. The relationship between raiders and the silo's leadership is shaped partly by the raiders' operational independence and partly by the community's dependence on raider returns. In most communities, there is a genuine appreciation for the raider program at the leadership level, even when specific decisions about mission objectives or resource allocation are contested. But the relationship is rarely simple. Raider commanders have direct knowledge of surface conditions that leadership often lacks. Leadership has community-wide perspective and authority that raider commanders often lack. The negotiation between those two knowledge bases and those two types of authority is one of the persistent dynamics of silo governance. The rare individuals who have been both raiders and significant figures in silo governance are treated as particularly authoritative voices in community debates about surface strategy because they have both the direct surface experience that most governance figures lack and the community-wide perspective that most raiders lack. Those individuals are rare because the two roles make very different demands and because the mortality of the raider role creates a strong prior against long raider careers. But when they exist, they tend to be among the most effective advocates for integrated approaches to surface strategy that account for both operational realities and community-wide considerations. The experience of losing a surface team and then having to decide whether and how to send another is one of the most difficult leadership situations in silo governance. The practical reality of raider mortality means that most programs with sufficient history have faced this decision multiple times. The factors that go into it, the value of what was being pursued, the assessment of why the loss occurred and whether that risk is addressable, the state of the surviving raider contingent, the views of the broader community are complex and often in tension. The decisions made in those moments are some of the most consequential decisions in silo governance, and the records of how different communities have made them are among the most instructive documents in the inter-silo knowledge base. The cultural mythology around specific legendary raiders, figures whose specific exploits have been told and retold in silo communities, is one of the ways that communities transmit values and capabilities across generations. These figures, whether historical individuals whose achievements have been reliably documented or composite characters assembled from multiple real histories, embody specific qualities that the community values. The qualities that legendary raiders are described as possessing are not always the ones you might expect. Raw courage appears, but so does patience and precision, and the ability to make difficult ethical decisions under pressure, and the capacity to recognize when not to act. The full picture that legendary raider figures present is more complex than simple heroism. The question of what raiders observe about their own psychological states during and after surface missions is one that the most reflective raiders have written about in ways that are significant for understanding the long-term human cost of the raider program. The specific forms of psychological alteration that come from repeated exposure to the extremity of surface operations are not simple trauma responses, though those also occur. There is something more specific, a gradual shift in the perceptual and cognitive baseline that comes from extended exposure to the scale, danger, and strangeness of the post-cascade surface. Raiders who have spent significant time on the surface often describe the underground as feeling increasingly small, not just physically, but experientially. The underground becomes harder to inhabit fully. The specific ways that different raiders have described the experience of encountering arc machines in non-hostile contexts are among the most lore-rich personal accounts in the raider record. The non-hostile encounter, an arc machine that is going about its operational business without targeting the raider present, is both more common than the hostile encounter in certain operational contexts, and more psychologically complex. The experience of watching an arc machine work, of observing its purposefulness and competence, of being close enough to hear and feel its operation while it is neither threatening nor threatened, does something to the observer that the hostile encounter does not. Several raiders have described these moments as the ones that most challenged their prior understanding of what arc was, not because the arc machine did anything dramatic, but because of how clearly purposeful and non-random it appeared. The contribution of individual raiders to the community's understanding of arc is not always, or even primarily, through formal research outputs. Much of what the most sophisticated silo research communities know about arc behavior, arc machine design, and arc operational patterns came originally from detailed observations by raiders who are not primarily researchers, who are out there doing a job and bringing back, along with the material outputs of that job, the kind of specific, concrete observations that are only possible from direct experience. The translation of that experiential knowledge into the theoretical frameworks that research communities work with is one of the ongoing intellectual projects of the most productive silo research institutions. The long-term trajectory of the Raider program across the decades since the Cascade has moved in a direction that was not always expected. Early in the post-Cascade period, the assumption in most communities was that the Raider program was a temporary necessity, a bridge to a future when the surface would be accessible again in a more conventional way. As the years passed and that future did not arrive, the assumption shifted. The Raider program began to be understood not as a temporary bridge, but as a long-term human presence on the surface. And with that shift in understanding came a shift in how the program was designed, what it prioritized, and what kind of person it recruited. The Raider is not a temporary specialist in a crisis. The Raider is a practitioner in a long-term engagement with the transformed surface of Earth. The specific moments in Raider history that the lore treats as turning points are not always the dramatic ones. Some of the most significant shifts in how the Raider program operates came from relatively undramatic events, a particular observation that challenged a prior assumption, a communication between community researchers that connected two previously separate threads, a mission debrief that generated a new question that previous frameworks had not asked. The dramatic moments, the dramatic recoveries, the dramatic escapes, the dramatic discoveries are the ones that make it into the cultural narratives, but the turning points that mattered most to the intellectual and operational development of the Raider program are often the quiet ones. The ethical framework that raiders operate under is not simply a set of rules imposed from outside. It has been developed, refined, and revised by raiders themselves over the generations, in dialogue with their communities, in response to specific situations where existing frameworks proved inadequate. The core commitments of that ethical framework: protecting team members, not wasting resources, reporting accurately, using force proportionally, respecting the complexity of what is encountered, are not arbitrary. They reflect specific lessons learned from specific failures. The Raider ethical tradition is an empirical one, grounded in experience rather than in abstract principle, and it has been refined by the kind of testing that only genuine, high-stakes situations can provide. The relationship between raiders and the concept of ownership, specifically the question of what belongs to whom on the surface, is one that the law treats with significant complexity. Pre-cascade concepts of property apply imperfectly or not at all to a surface environment that has been largely transformed by ARC. The materials and technology that raiders recover were in many cases manufactured or owned by people who are no longer alive.